Now, the priorities today are slightly different. There are bigger issues that really matter. It includes, of course, this sense of belonging, but the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are a very good framework to work with. A second thing that is really important in what I'm saying is what we're really talking about is developing a comprehensive culture of creativity that rides through every facet of a city's life or being. And when I say city, I also mean town, small, big, and so on. So this reminds us there's social innovation, scientific innovation, business innovation, and also bureaucratic innovations that have happened. And they all were based on forms of creativity that underlined them. And one thing, as a brief reminder, of course, is that massive breakthrough, the digital turn. And that has actually changed, of course, the way we think of place and space. Its volume, variety, and absolute immensity has enabled us to be anywhere, anytime, in any place. And that, of course, transfigures how you see the world and what the world is for you. It makes the world a smaller place. And it has, of course, all of this immense advantages, but also disadvantages. You cannot hide from big data that enables all of this to happen. Our privacy may be threatened. And companies such as Facebook, now called Meta, may be having far too much power over us. But what it has done, it's enabled perhaps 5 million apps to be developed, several of which help us share things and create a new form of economy that might be called the sharing economy. But what it does in the end as well is shape the way we see the city and feel the city. And this is where things like third spaces come into play, places where we're neither home or work. And this has been reinforced by the pandemic through hybrid working. And these third spaces, often in regenerated old buildings like this, are precisely what people seem to like, working with history, but innovating at the same time in those structures. So a question to all of us, can you measure creativity? Well, I think you can. But let's just start first. The key issue, and I only really discovered that a bit later, is to develop a culture of curiosity. I was working in Gateshead, Newcastle, and there was an unemployed person, a young man, and they kept on saying to people like him, become an entrepreneur. His father and parents were both unemployed. So how can that person suddenly be an entrepreneur? So what you have to do is work with where they are and what they've got. And let's say they love music. Okay, you get them involved in a music project. They might dream of being a star, a pop star, but 1 in 1,000 only become one. But they may learn technology along the way, all sorts of skills that operate there. They can learn expression, communication, and digital stuff, particularly today. And that can be applied to many other environments and work opportunities. And once you have curiosity, you might be able to imagine things. And when you imagine things, you might have some creative ideas. You might have 10 creative ideas, of which only 3 are useful, which might become a kind of invention. And when applied, they then become an innovation. And that whole cycle repeats itself because all of this process encourages us to be curious again. Now, we should think about the qualities of different types of creativity, that of the individual. I think we know what that is partly about, being able to think afresh, as I said, to be open-minded, to see connections between various things, just to use the boundaries of one's mind to think about the unexpected, about expressing yourself. But when you think of the organization, if you only had people like that there all the time, what would you be able to do? You'd probably create an organization that's flying all over the place. So you need different types of qualities, the quality of being able to implement things. And implementing things can also be creative, just as much as being the person who checks and asks questions about whether things work. But anyway, so that's different. Working in a team then has a different form of creativity. And then think of a system, just think of housing as an example. There are so many aspects to housing, and affordability is one of the greatest problems of our time. So when you think of a housing system, there are so many things going on, public, private, civic, all these sorts of housing. How can you generate incentives and financing regimes that keep affordability in the long term there? So that would be being creative in a system. And then you've got that lovely thing, the city or the town. And in there, you've got all these different cultures of these individuals who are perhaps not aligned. And the creative city agenda tries to, through a story, get people to move in a similar direction. So you get win-win situations. And then finally, what is the creativity of the state or nation? And that is another level of complexity where all of these things are ideally being able to fit together. This all implies taking a 360-degree perspective. So incorporating the public sector worlds, thinking through and working with the civic worlds, then the business worlds, big and small, and then the research worlds, formal, informal, vocational trainers and simple academic researchers, and also, of course, the cultural worlds. And it means, this creative city agenda, communicating with all these worlds and trying to see the patterns and things that you can do together. So in summary, the overarching qualities that I'm talking about are openness as a default. I'm not pretending you have to be open 24/7 because that would drive you crazy if you continually every minute had to reassess things. But there is the need to be willing to reassess. And what one might do in that is you look at the tried and tested and say, does it still work? If it still works, you might say, we'll keep it. But at least we have reassessed. And that requires us thinking in this more organic, dynamic way. But you may think in that assessment that things need to change. And there, applying the sort of what-if logic is very helpful. So you might say, how do we create a planet B? What if? What if these things work differently? How can we work backwards to achieving that? Now, the what ifs can be very broad, but at least we know if we're trying planet B, we will also know that we have to get planet A right too. But what is really crucial in all of this is this transdisciplinary connecting of different disciplines. Now, that's not being against people who are expert in a particular discipline. It's focusing on them, understanding that there is more than just one form of knowledge, that we need to bring these things together. And that's why there is the need also to think through divergent thinking. This opening out is opening oneself out to all sorts of things. But at some point, we have to draw in and think convergently, tighten, go through the reality checker, work out what works and doesn't. In all of this, there are dangers, of course. And one of the big paradoxes about the creativity agenda is that we all talk about, let's be more creative, imaginative, etc. And at the same time, there's a risk culture that often precisely stops any new ideas coming out. Another I've already touched upon. There is the creative economy sector. So when we say creativity, we don't only mean the creativity of the arts forms, we also mean these other forms. So perhaps we should always be talking in terms of a culture of creativity, creativity in the economy, creativity in society, and so on. A couple of further dangers: that many people, many towns and cities just use culture for image purposes, which is really using those perhaps inspirational people without actually acknowledging the heart of the content that they have. A second danger is that these processes about the creative city agenda is about improving places and improving buildings, particularly often old buildings. And that then obviously becomes attractive, ideally, and particularly if there's a bit of an arts input there. Now, the initial aim was not to gentrify, but I would say that many of these places that are renewed are in very poor areas, and some element of gentrification is very positive. They also want third spaces, people who are poor. They also want to hang out. They also want to watch the world go by. So this is not only about hipsters and so on. Now, another way of now bringing this together is something called the Creative City Index, which I developed with a colleague, Jonathan Hyams, in Bilbao many, many years ago. And that has 4 clusters. And the first we assess, can you identify and nurture the creativity in a place? And what this looks at is the various components, questions and so on. How much openness is there? Is it a place that trusts each other? Is there accessibility places? You know, can you get around and so on? Is there participation? A key thing. The second thing it looks at is what the learning landscape looks like, formal education and informal. Are there ladders of opportunity to move from A to B? The second cluster looks at enabling and supporting creativity. And this concerns the public framework and the political framework. What are the incentives and regulations that push these ideas forward? Are there various forms of grants or loans and so on? The second is the strategic leadership. Is there a story that leadership, and when I say leadership, I mean more than one person. It could be in a city just 1%, and in a city of 1 million, that's at least 10,000 people. So there you want to see that they have a story to tell that's compelling, that draws people together, but at the same time that they're agile and flexible. And I always say, you need to be strategically principled and tactically flexible. You have some core aims, let's say being sustainable, and you have that and it's non-negotiable, but you're tactically flexible because you don't know how you're going to get there. And then finally, on that point, you really is this question of professionalism. How professional is the place? Does it actually just walk the talk or just talk the talk? And that is a key to everything. The third domain cluster is exploiting and harnessing that. So how do you assess that? We believe you look at then entrepreneurship programs, levels of entrepreneurship in economic, social and other senses, and how much exploratory activity is going on, how many innovations have been created. It also looks at communication in the place. How are people networking, coming together, bringing their ideas together, having dialogue, having conversations across cultures and different diversities? But it's also the physical side of that. How many trains, planes they have or have access to move around, obviously roads and bike lanes and all of that as well. And the final cluster is about living and expressing creativity, because so much creativity is hidden behind doors. We don't even know it exists. It's in the way someone's mind has changed, a process of running a place or an organization. And so here one really needs to see and make that intangible tangible, the invisible visible. And what then comes out ideally is that distinctiveness, ideally that diversity, the vitality and the expression of a place. And that might be in many forms. It might be built forms, which are interesting for you to look at. It might be public space that entices you to connect. It might be, of course, festivals, events, rituals, and all of those sorts of things. The second point is place and placemaking. Many places are originally in their historic core quite interesting, but the new things that are being built are not very interesting at all. So one needs to monitor that. Sometimes, very rarely, the old places are completely ugly and horrible and the new is wonderful, but that needs to be assessed. And finally, there is this issue of livability. Livability in the sense of what facilities are there for you? Are there hospitals there? Are they good? Are there parks? Are there leisure facilities? All the things that make life interesting and helpful to me to survive and feel well. Is there good retailing? Is that retailing diverse? Or is it only chain shops that make you feel the world is incredibly dull? And so on. And the way we measure this, and it might seem trivial, is between 1 and 10. 10 is very bad, sorry, 10 is very good, in fact, sorry, and 1 is very bad. And in the middle there, you might say, oh, that's trivial to say, oh, this person and this place has got a 5. But the point is not the 5, it's what did you need to do to get from 4 to 5? What do you need to do to get from 5 to 6 and to 7? What are the qualities and characteristics and the projects you need to do to make that happen? And the results can surprise. I mean, Mannheim, for example, is a great city in Germany, which has one of the best regeneration projects, I think, in Europe, Jungbusch, based on music. It had a pop academy there, run by a business musician person who's from the business world and an artist musician. Not surprisingly, many of the students who come out of there get a job. But next to this place is student housing. There's a music park, an incubator center. There are other incubator centers developing and moving along this strip. But what we did discover, that Mannheim has a lack of confidence. It was destroyed in the war. And so therefore, what is the strategy for a lack of confidence? Perhaps it's an art project, but not necessarily so. In Adelaide, the problem was that the state of South Australia is so dominant, and the city itself hasn't really got enough power and resources to express its vision in its own terms. In Krakow, the issue, and this perhaps is a post-socialist problem a bit more than here, although we have the same problem in the West and other parts of Europe, is how the public administration was siloed. And in Bilbao, where it was all created, this way of looking at things, was that there was a danger it would rest on its laurels, because the achievement of the Guggenheim effect, but much more to it, of course, as many know, the whole public space management of the city is absolutely wonderful. But perhaps it felt, oh, don't threaten anything. We've already done so well. And in terms of Helsinki, some of the lessons that we learned from our studies was it doesn't shout very much. And that is actually at one level absolutely wonderful. But we do need to know the things they are doing, many of which are extraordinary.